Hey, it's Coach Anderson here from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up again with Unit 12. And in Unit 12, what we've been talking about, of course, is the 1960s. We talked previously, of course, about the presidencies of LBJ and, of course, of John F. Kennedy. And we're going to transition a little bit towards some of the struggles they had. And we talked already a little bit about the Civil Rights Movement. And today we're going to finish up talking a little bit about the Vietnam War and its impact on America. We're going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to start like we always do, of course, with a unit focus question. And we have 4 unit focus questions here: identify and describe Kennedy's and Johnson's domestic and foreign policy goals, trials, and accomplishments; identify the origin, major players, strategies, and accomplishments of the modern civil rights movement; describe the impact of the Vietnam War, which is where we'll be today, on American life and politics; and what impact did the civil rights movement have on other underserved and underrepresented groups in America. And once again, as we always say, we will not address the unit focus question at this time, but we will come back, of course, at the end of the unit and have a discussion about what those answers are. We're going to start with our vocabulary, just as we always do, tell you to take out your journals and write down these words and define them yourself. And as we see them, as they come up in the lesson, we'll address as many of them as we can. Lesson focus questions we will address at the end of the lesson. This is: what effect did the Vietnam War have on the election of 1968, and what steps did Richard Nixon take to end the Vietnam War? Well, with that, we'll go ahead and we'll get started. And today we'll start with our Do Now activity. And the Do Now activity is this journal topic: why do major political parties usually nominate incumbents to serve as the party's nomination for president? We'll give you a few minutes and let you contemplate your answer, and we'll be back in a few moments. Well, when you think about it, you would want an incumbent, of course, to be, your party's, nominee. That, either that president or that vice president had been the face of the party, of course, in the 4 years, of course, prior to their election. And it would seem that the most important thing to do is familiarity when it comes to elections in most places. All too often, more people vote, of course, for familiarity than they do, of course, in some cases for issues. So having an incumbent in some cases gives you as a party a little bit of an advantage. And we're going to find that that's not always the case, especially when we look at the election of 1968 that comes a little bit later. American opposition to Vietnam. There were 2 groups, of course, that when it came to Vietnam: the Hawks, of course, who wanted to fight, and then the Doves, who wanted America to withdraw from Vietnam. And we're going to see that because of that struggle, it's going to cause a great many problems in America. One of the things that happens, of course, in the 1960s in protest to the Vietnam War are going to be the teach-ins. The teach-ins are going to be a technique that's going to be used where on college campuses, people are educated by Vietnam, and most turned against American involvement as a result of those teach-ins, which in most cases, of course, were led by young people. The disproportionate draft of poor and minorities also turned Americans against the war effort. Dr. King and Muhammad Ali were just 2 of many who rejected American involvement in Vietnam. And those are 2 very important voices, of course, in the black community. And when they speak out, of course, against the war, it's going to find that a lot of minorities who respect their opinions are going to turn in the opposite direction of Vietnam also. What we're going to do, of course, is look at some of these graphics, of course, from Vietnam. On the left, you see, I don't give a damn for Uncle Sam. I ain't going to Vietnam, and they would say, and draft card burning held here. These will be images that you'll see throughout the 60s in protest of Vietnam. Here you see the Louisville Mouth, the greatest. I just call him the champ, Muhammad Ali. He refuses to be inducted into the Army and to serve in Vietnam, and he echoed those feelings around the United States. So a lot of people felt the same way that he did, especially as a black man in America. He felt like that it was wrong, according to his religion, of course, to go and fight for what he saw as an unjust war. In 1968, one of the important years throughout the 1960s is going to be 1968, and there are going to be 5 things that will cause some of the tumult that will happen during the 1968. First thing, and the Tet Offensive started a tumultuous string of events in America in 1968. First, Tet showed that America was a long way from defeating the Viet Cong. So once again, in 1968, we're going to see that in America, things are going to really swing in the opposite direction when it comes to Vietnam, and that's primarily because of Tet. Second, LBJ refuses to seek re-election in March 1968. LBJ refuses, faces opposition in his own party. Eugene McCarthy emerges as an early opponent in the Democratic race for the nomination. And when Kennedy, of course, when Robert F. Kennedy, of course, gets in, we're going to find that LBJ, of course, is going to step out because he doesn't feel like he can win the election. And he's not even sure if he's going to win the nomination of his party, even though he's the incumbent. Dr. King was assassinated by James Earl Ray, leading to riots throughout American cities in 1968. And then fourth, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan while campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination, which he probably would have won had he lived. After a campaign event in California, he was, exiting the stage and was leaving through a hallway through by the kitchen, and he's shot and killed by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian nationalist that opposed, Robert F. Kennedy because of Kennedy's support for the Israelis during the Arab-Israeli War. Finally, violence erupts outside the Democratic National Convention in 1968 over Vietnam protests, and the Republican Richard Nixon will be elected president of the United States of America, primarily because he is someone that they are familiar with, because he had been the vice president, of course, under Eisenhower. In addition to that, he was promising peace with honor in Vietnam. And that's one of the galvanizing factors that allowed him and a group called the Silent Majority to put him in the White House in 1968. Violence on the campaign trail, once again, the death of Robert F. Kennedy. On the left, the younger brother, of course, is John F. Kennedy, who, of course, was assassinated in 1963. And here we have the Palestinian nationalist, Sirhan Sirhan, who's responsible for his assassination. On the left, after the death of Kennedy, who would probably have gotten the nomination, we have the Democrat, who was the vice presidential under LBJ, the incumbent vice president, who runs against Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon, of course, wins when Hubert Humphrey, of course, fails to capture the imagination of the American public. The Silent Majority, the people responsible for putting Nixon in the White House, they're commonly called the Silent Majority because they were the people in America who were the older generation that wanted peace and order and the end to the turmoil and because of the disarray in the Democratic Party, Nixon prevails. Peace with honor is what Nixon promised the Silent Majority and the rest of America. Nixon's plan to end Vietnam started with the appointment of Henry Kissinger as Assistant for National Security Affairs. Kissinger was tasked with Vietnamization, or the gradual withdrawal of American troops in Vietnam. Nixon advocated an end to the Vietnam War, but secretly authorized bombings in Cambodia and an invasion in 1970. Whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg exposed some of Nixon's actions, of course, in Vietnam with something called the Pentagon Papers, and it detailed the U.S. decision to make during the Vietnam War, which showed the dishonesty the government engaged in regarding the Vietnam War. And this causes more and more people to become disenchanted, of course, with Nixon and disenchanted with the American government because they felt like they were being lied to. Nixon's actions led to protests and violence at Kent State and Jackson State, where students were killed by the National Guard. And once again, these are events that cause a lot of people, of course, to kind of look at the United States of America in terms of its role in the affairs of the rest of the world and go, maybe we should rethink the way that we're doing things. Here we have Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor, of course, of Richard Nixon, and becomes the Secretary of State under Nixon and Gerald Ford. Here we have Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower responsible for the Pentagon Papers that showed America's secret bombings, of course, in Vietnam. The U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam a month before the election of 1972. Kissinger announced an agreement to end the Vietnam War, and Nixon won the election in 1972. On January 27, 1973, the Vietnam War ended, and the United States started the process of removing American troops from South Vietnam. April 30, 1975, the last American troops left Saigon, and shortly thereafter, South Vietnam became communist, following Cambodia that fell in January 1975 to the Khmer Rouge, and Laos becomes communist after the fall of Saigon. And so that whole idea of the domino theory, if you allow one nation to fall to communism, Southeast Asia, the others will soon follow, kind of comes true to some degree. So Eisenhower's idea of the domino theory does indeed look like it could be some some validity behind it. Here you have the evacuation of Saigon. You have Henry Kissinger on the left, and he is briefing President Gerald Ford on the right, and then, of course, the Vice President Nelson Rockefeller in the middle. Here is the Operation Frequent Wind. It was used to evacuate, sympathizers and people who had cooperated with the United States of America and get all American personnel, of course, out of Vietnam. Here's Pol Pot. Pol Pot becomes the leader of Kampuchea or Cambodia, and he leads the Communist Party, the Khmer Rouge, that's responsible for killing about 1.2 million Cambodians that were opposed to communism. So we're seeing the domino theory to some degree, of course, come to fruition. Vietnam's legacy: distrust, cynicism, black eye on American military because of the atrocities at My Lai with Lieutenant William Calley, and that's a whole nother can of worms itself. We see for the first time that Americans are seen as being the enemies or the committers of atrocities. The reduction in the presidential authority to commit American troops into combat with the War Powers Act is going to be something that's going to be created, and no president will have the the ability, of course, to commit American troops without congressional approval. 58,000 American troops killed, most of which were poor or minorities, and some returned home with PTSD, which becomes the first time somebody kind of recognizes this ailment. Before then, there was an allusion to something called shell shock. So we actually give it a name, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It split America in two sides, for and against the war. And we're looking at a situation in America where things don't get better overnight when it comes to Vietnam's legacy. Even when the troops return home, they don't return home to a hero's welcome. The Pentagon Papers. What we're going to do is give you a few minutes, and what we're going to do is allow you to access the video, access the video in the video description. And then what we want you to do, of course, is to view the video and complete the activities. And when you're done, turn your work into, convert it into a PDF file, and then turn it, of course, into your Teach to Be Graded. Good luck, and we'll allow you to navigate there at this time. All right, you should have plenty of time that you were able to go through, of course, and view the film, of course, on the Pentagon Papers. We hope you got some real insights as to why it is that the American public has started to fall out a little bit or started to become a little disillusioned, of course, with the Nixon administration because of Vietnam. And Daniel Ellsberg, of course, in some people's mind is a hero, in some people's mind is a villain. For his release release of these papers. And it basically puts a black eye on the presidency and a black eye, of course, on Nixon for a minute. All right, what we're going to do now, of course, is look at our lesson focus questions. We had two that we're going to address. The first is what effect did the Vietnam War have on the election of 1968? And two, what steps did Nixon take to end the war in Vietnam? Well, the first one, what effect did the Vietnam War have on the election of 1968? It caused division at home in America, with most Americans questioning U.S. involvement. And fortunately for the LBJ, he became synonymous with the war. And because of that, he refused to seek the Democratic nomination in '68. Democrats instead nominate LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who becomes one of the first, in the last 60 years, he's one of only two Democratic candidates, of course, that didn't have to go through the primary process. Hubert Humphrey in '68 and Kamala Harris in 2024. And a lot of people would argue that's one of the biggest reasons why he wasn't successful, and one of the reasons why some would think that she wasn't successful, because they didn't take the traditional route to the nomination. What steps did Nixon take to end the Vietnam War? Nixon instituted Vietnamization, which was a gradual turnover of the fighting to the South Vietnamese, with the U.S. providing training, reducing the American troop deployment from over 500,000 to 30,000 by 1969, which he didn't reach, by the way, and then starting peace negotiations in 1968 and secret bombing campaigns to influence the North Vietnamese to return to the negotiating table. Well, we hope you had this was enlightening to you to some degree. I realize there's a lot of information, but when you're thinking about 1968 and you're talking about the Vietnam War, it's a lot of information, of course, to kind of ingest. But once again, don't take my word for it. Make sure that you go ahead and do your own research and draw your own conclusions. And with that, I'll see you next time.